Hey, fellow tennis nerds, I hope all is well. Today I'm joined and honored to be joined by Michael Joyce, a famous coach, and he was also a very, very good player, ranked 60 in the world in 1996, if I remember correctly. And he's now traveling with his player Ashlyn Krueger there in Nottingham, but he has coached Sharapova, Pegula, Madison Keys, Azarenka. The list is long and impressive. But today we're going to talk about Ashlyn, and we're going to talk about his life as a coach. But first of all, how are you today, Michael?
Great. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so you're now going the famous transition, which we've talked about before, like from clay to grass. How difficult is that for the player and also for you as a coach to do that transition?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's one of those transitions. It's always pretty big. I mean, obviously you're going from clay to grass. It's like one extreme to the other, but I think it depends a little bit on the players. I know for me, it was always an easy transition, more of like a hardcore player. I always felt like when clay court season was over, it was kind of like you're looking forward to getting on the grass. I mean, Maria was always like that. She ended up winning 2 French Opens at the end of her career, but early in her career, she was looking forward to the grass. Pegula, Jessie, Ashlyn, today was our first day on grass, and you could tell like she was really excited to be on it. And I think a lot of it's a mindset. You know, I'm sure like clay court specialists, let's say, they probably take a little longer to adjust and maybe don't look forward to it as much. But I think you can adjust pretty quick. I think probably the biggest thing is the body. You know, everything's bouncing lower, your body getting used to bad bounces, things quicker. So I think the first couple of days, even though you're really excited to get on it and play a lot, you have to kind of maintain your body and kind of work into it a little bit. But it's always been pretty easy for me and my players.
When it comes to I mean, you went from Paris, right? And Ashlyn had a really rough loss there, lost to Korpatch in 11-9 in the patch tiebreak, right? How do you recover from that? Like, what's the vibe and what is important for you to do as a coach, kind of?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, she's a young player. Obviously, she just turned 20. It was her first time main draw French Open. Australian Open is similar. She lost a really tight first round. The girl went on to win the tournament. You know, she's had some pretty tough draws in Grand Slam. She hasn't won a main draw match yet, which I know is heavy on her mind. You know, obviously she wants to do that. And Paris, this year at the French, it was tough. I mean, obviously the conditions were tough on everybody. It rained like a ton. We went to Strasbourg the week before and it rained a lot as well. So we felt like it was almost like 8 or 9 days before she played where we hadn't really seen the sun. I think we had 1 day of practice in the sun. The day she played was a really tough day. I mean, you know, obviously tough on both girls, but she was supposed to play 11 o'clock and we got delayed about 5 or 6 hours. And then she pretty much played the whole match in the rain, you know, which slows down the courts. One of the biggest things that people don't realize is that a lot of water accumulates in the back of the court, like in the tarps. And you could actually see balls sitting like in puddles of water. And then the ball boys like throwing the ball and the ball was orange and it was wet. Super heavy. I was really proud of her comeback. She was down 4-1 in the third and actually came back serve for the match at 6-5 and then had match point at 9-8. So she fought really hard. It was very tough conditions on both players. So, you know, it was kind of like a heartbreaking loss because obviously you go over, you know, this point different, that point different. It could have changed. But at the end of the day, you know, I think she'll learn a lot from it. I think next time she plays in those conditions, French Open, she'll be a little bit more prepared. There's nothing like on-the-job training, especially when you're young like that. And, you know, we try to just take it as like a learning experience and hopefully if she improves and learns from it like she usually does, then it can, one day we'll look back and it'll probably be almost a good thing that happened. So try to paint that picture. Obviously, it's always the best.
How is it to work with different players now, and how is this selection process, partly for you, but also for them, I guess? Like, how do you find a fit as a player and a coach relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I've been pretty lucky in a way of most of the players I work with that I've had long relationships with. Maria, Jesse, now with Ashlyn. I've known them since they're young, and usually I have pretty long stints with them. I had a few years where I, worked with Vika for, Azarenka for like 8 months. Because of circumstances, we just couldn't really continue. She was having issues, personal issues, on Konta for a year. I mean, it's, especially on the women's tour, you see a lot of switching around between players and coaches. And I think that's, sometimes it's needed, but I also think that's why you see a lot of young players kind of get, their development maybe gets derailed a little bit, or, it's hard. Obviously, you're coaching some of the best female athletes in the world. I mean, even if they're 100 in the world, I mean, if you think about it, they've reached a really elite level, and it's usually like small differences that, really make a big difference. And those small differences don't just happen overnight. Sometimes you might see a player switch coaches and they'll do really good the first week or two because they're, pumped up and everybody's fired up, and maybe the new coach helps their confidence. But usually over time is where I feel like you can build a relationship, because it's so much more than just the X's and O's of tennis. I mean, I think a lot of people and a lot of players kind of know what they need to do, or maybe they know what they're not doing under pressure. But, it's not so easy. It's one thing to say, this is what you need to do. It's another thing to get the player to actually do it, and the player to believe that this is what I need to do. And I feel like that takes trust. It takes time. And, sometimes it's hard because it's fun sometimes working with a new player because they're really listening to everything you say. And it's like, you feel like really important. And, sometimes when you're with somebody for a long time, you sometimes even feel like you have weeks where it's like, I don't want to say like stale, but it's like you're sending the same message, and you're kind of like, trying to build their confidence and believe. But I do believe, like, the young players, you have to stay the course. If there's something that I feel like my player needs that I can't really get through to them, or I can't help them, then I try to maybe find somebody else or something for a small period of time. But I think you'll see on the men's tour, you see a lot of players who have coaches for pretty much a long time. Like Alcor, you could see like probably the top 10, 20 players have coaches. Like, I remember when center switched coaches, it was like a huge deal, like with Piatti to the, even with Darren, like it was like a huge deal. Like, he's switching coaches, and I think it was an easy transition. I'm sure he still talks to Piatti and a good friend, whatever. But like in the women's tour, you see a lot of like women struggle a couple weeks and then they want a new voice. So they jump into another coach, or, and I think ultimately that usually doesn't work. I mean, every once in a while you might see it, but ultimately I don't think that switching all the time is great for the confidence. People forget that you're traveling with these players, the player-coach relationship, you're traveling week after week. It's almost like your family. So you got to feel comfortable with the person. I do think the longer relationships tend to have the best benefits, and I've been pretty fortunate that I've had that with a number of players. And I think it's kind of how I work best. So I like that.
What would you say is your skill? Like, you must be making them quite at ease with your way of being, because you can like keep these relationships for so long, and they seem quite positive if you look at the results, for sure, so.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, every player is different. I mean, that I think that's probably one of the best things that a good coach has, is that, you have to learn a lot about your player before you can really help them. I mean, obviously you can work with somebody briefly and give them a tip or help them a little bit. But like, I know, how I approach, let's say, Ashen is different than how I approach Pegula, or, Pegula a little bit different than Maria. I think a good coach is able to try to send the message, get the message across, in different ways. And also with the younger girls too, they're changing all the time. I mean, yeah, I probably even treat Ashlyn a little bit different now than I did when she was like 17 or 16. I mean, I think the player has to trust you, and I try to always tell the truth. I mean, there's different times to say things. I mean, you can't, always say something right when you feel it. You gotta, is it going to go in in one ear and out the other just because they're frustrated, or, I was a player myself. So I understand a little bit the feelings, like this last match in Paris. I mean, Ashton was devastated right after the match. She has match point, and, it's like, I'm not going to sit there like 5 minutes after the match, like telling her all the things she could have done different, and obviously even like sometimes it takes a couple of days to really sink in and to really like understand like what I do different maybe next time, things that you did well. I think it's really important. Like, I like to also give a lot of information a lot of times when the players are winning, because even when like a lot of times they're winning and they can handle maybe some, I don't want to say negativity, but some things they could be doing better, always seems to sink in better when they're happy and they feel like they're doing well. I mean, that's how I was. A lot of times when I lost, it was like I didn't want to hear from anybody, but then when I won, I was like open to pretty much anything. So I think a good coach is obviously knows their player, and that helps too, because when you know the player for a long time, because you have a sense of when is the best time to get information across, when is it sometimes you got to just leave them, and so that I feel like probably from all the years of doing it and being a player myself, it's probably why it's easy for me to have longer relationships with the players, because they know I have their back. They know I'm there to help them. And, even if I say things maybe they don't always want to hear, if I say it at the right times, it's going to pay off eventually. So I think that's probably the secret. It's not always easy, but, I think I'm pretty good at that probably.
Is it maybe like underestimated a little bit more on the WTA side that stability is also needed? Like the part of the coaching thing is that you have a stable voice, although they might say the same things, which I think in if you take Raducanu as an example, like she's been notorious for changing her coaches. Maybe her father I don't know that story, but the idea has been, from what I heard, is that, okay, you take information from one coach, then you take information from one coach, and take information from one coach, and you try to learn as much as you can, but it's also a point that you have a steady voice there as a part of your...
Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously some people think that way. I mean, I think that's probably one thing that's maybe a little bit tougher now than it was maybe even 20 years ago. I think partly because of the publicity, social media, pretty much every match on the WTA tour, people can watch. That's one thing I noticed, like with Maria, obviously she was one of the top players, so you could watch a lot of her matches. But like Jessie, I mean, I can tell you with Jessie at 18, 19, she played, tons of matches without, people back at home or agents, or, I'm just using examples, watching every match, right? So, a lot of times when I think some of these players, they probably have, a lot of different voices coming at them, trying to give them and a lot of times the information is correct. The problem is a player, can a lot of times can only have so many thoughts in their head, or they can only, a lot of times these matches are won and lost by a couple points. You could sit there and say, oh, okay, this match, you lost, 10-8 in the third set, but, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, you didn't do that. But at the end of the day, if you think about it, probably 4 or 5 different points would have completely changed the outcome of the match, right? So sometimes too much information, I think, confuses the players. I think it causes some, what's the word? Some confusion. Maybe they don't, it's tough. A lot of times, I mean, even when I used to play, it's like, a lot of times my dad would give me a lot of information if he came and watched me, but I'm sitting here going, okay, well, that's great. Yeah, I know I should have done this, this, and this, but why didn't I do it? Or how can I do it next time? Or, give me some advice on how I can do that better. Not just like, I know I should have served better. It's like a typical, even amateur players, like, they're serving 50% first serve, and, everybody's telling them, oh, you need to get your first serve in. Well, I'm sure the player, I mean, most of them, maybe some don't, but probably knows that they need to get their first serve in, right? But the more they're thinking like, I need to get my first serve in, I need to get my, the more they maybe don't get their first serve in, right? So it's like, I think that's happens in tennis a lot. It's like, thinking clearly. I mean, think about the players that's what basically confidence is. When a player wins a tournament or they're confident, they're playing well, they're seeing the ball well, they're moving well, everything's kind of flowing, and they maybe aren't even thinking that much, right? So, when you're, struggling or tough matches. I mean, I think that's what every player is trying to get to, the point where they, they're kind of flowing and they're kind of, relaxed, they're thinking clearly, they're breathing. All of that stuff to me is more important than just like, oh, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to do that. And I think that's where a lot of in the women's tour, women, I think you see a little bit more. I mean, Felix, a good example. He struggled so much, right? Like the last year or so, you didn't see him get rid of his coach. I mean, they brought in Tony, for a while, but that coach that's Fontang, I think, Frederick Fontang, I think he's been with him since he was young, right? So, when Felix starts slumping, I don't think he right away thinks I'm struggling because of my coach, right? I mean, the coach is probably doing the same thing, that he did when he was on his way up. I mean, maybe, he make a couple tweaks here or there, but, I think Felix was struggling more internally. And I think the fact that he understood that, and now it's good to see him, he's starting to, play better again. So I don't know if it's a way of men thinking, women thinking. I don't know. I don't know, maybe partly because women have switched coaches so much and it's become such a big thing on the tour that it's just kind of normal. You see a few stories where players are struggling and then they get a new coach, they do well. So then maybe the other 10 girls, they go, I'm going to try that. I mean, it's hard to say, but, sometimes maybe it's the coach as well. I mean, the player, sometimes the players, women can be a little stubborn at times. I mean, so can men, but I know a lot of really good players that women can be pretty stubborn. Maybe they're set in their ways and, but it could be a lot of different things. But I do think if you're a player and you have, let's say, a circle around you and you have constant like doubt or somebody saying, oh, you need a better coach, or you need this, or you need that. I think eventually the player will crack and then they're going to say, okay, let me try something new. And I don't think it always works. I think if you look at it, probably hurts them more than helps them, And so I think that's partly maybe why I like to kind of work with players who I knew since they were younger too, because, I think I also a pretty good judge of who I can work with, who can understand me, who can understand my messages. Sometimes I think less is more, sometimes where a lot of other people think the other way, but I have a lot of confidence in the players I work with, that they're smart, that they, a lot of times they can figure things out, which I think ultimately gives them a lot more confidence, long run, so there's little things that, everybody's a work in progress, right? So it's, I think that's part of probably kind of my philosophy, that you kind of have to stay the course. I think consistency is really important, especially when we're living in such a inconsistent life, right? Just surfaces, hotels, the continents, we have so many inconsistencies that when you are a player and you can hold on to a couple consistencies, I think it really helps you overall.
Do you think, you mentioned social media and the presence of phone and data and all the things, do you think that might be one reason, like it's more of a society now where we externalize things? So maybe the players are quicker to externalize and try to point the blame if something goes wrong, because like if you have a few losses, sure. It happens also in football. Like if you have a few losses, it's like, oh, we have to fire the coach. It's like, sure. It has to fix it straight away,
Right. Yeah, well, I always say, there was that term in like Moneyball, I love like the coach or the GM's like the first one through the wall is the bloodiest or whatever. I mean, listen, if you're a player, you can't fire yourself, right? So if you're struggling or, it's the same with a team. I mean, you can make some changes with players, but in tennis, it's just you, it's an individual sport. If you're struggling, you can't put somebody in for you. You can't have somebody jump in. It's just you, and you can't fire yourself. So, a lot of times, obviously, probably the first one to kind of, if you're going to make a big change, it's probably the coach. But at the same time, I think that's also where I think a lot of times problems come in, because like I said, it's usually, I think if you're a pretty good player, you're a pretty smart person, you can tell pretty quick, like if the relationship with the coach is going to work or not, right? And like I said, I think information, especially nowadays with all the data and, you have all the analytics and you have, I think the X's and O's are pretty clear, and if you can't see like what a person needs to be doing better, especially maybe under pressure, if they have like some big holes in their game or whatever. I don't think that's hard for people to see. I think what makes a good player relationship is being able to change those things and to improve those things, especially like under pressure without, taking 2 steps backwards all the time, right? So, I do think that has a lot to do with it. Just the fact that it's probably easiest change to make is with a coach. And, maybe women in general, women tour, maybe they don't have the patience that men do. But yeah, it's hard to say. I just think, Raducanu is a really interesting situation, obviously. I think you see a lot of I think in Raducanu's, I don't know her situation that well, but I do think she's a good example of her father probably is very involved in her tennis. I think he has been since she was younger, as a coach and probably a supporter. You see that a lot too. Like most of these good players wouldn't be where they were if they didn't have a parent or parents. Usually it's a one that kind of does everything for the kids, from a young age. They're driving them to practice, they're giving them information, they're taking them to junior tournaments. Most of the time they know the kids probably better than the coaches do. But the kid gets to a point where, they're 20 years old or 21, they want to kind of maybe not listen to the parents as well. Maybe that relationship as coach, parent kind of runs its course, right? So, but then they're still the parents, so you have to be they're connected to them. They care. I dealt with that with my dad. I mean, my dad knew my game better than anybody. He probably 95% of what he told me was correct, right? But I didn't really want to hear it from him when I was 19, 20 years old, and I was making my own money. And, it was hard for me to decipher, is he giving me information because he's trying to help my tennis, or does he think I'm not working hard or I'm not doing this, And so I just wasn't at that age going to listen to every single thing he said. And then it became kind of really tough. And then obviously I got coaches, and then, I had the same coach for most of my whole career. I actually tried a couple times some other coaches, but I always went back to him because he felt like family, and, I had great results with him. I felt good with him. But I think that's also has a lot to do with it. So maybe Raducanu, a good example, maybe she brings in a coach and she does okay, then she starts to struggle, then her dad maybe's this isn't working and you got to try something else. And then, I'm sure that happens all the time. I'm not saying for sure that's her situation, but I'm sure that does happen quite a lot. And then now you're in the cycle of always hearing new information. Like you mentioned before, maybe she's getting good information from different coaches, but then she's not putting it all together, or she's not all of a sudden one thing's a big focus for one coach, and then all of a sudden now you're focusing on that, and then all of a sudden you're jumped to another coach who has a completely different philosophy, focus, or whatever. I mean, there's so many aspects within tennis, right? So, some coaches have things they focus on more than others, and I think the player, it's very easy for them to get confused. I mean, and ultimately it's going to take away their confidence, which a lot of these big matches come down to a few points and doing it day in and day out. And if you don't have that belief and confidence, I think it ultimately hurts the players probably.
It's kind of a thing in tennis, obviously, with the parents coaching and the parents being such a big part of the team. And in some cases, it's tough to maybe add a coach, or coaches usually don't stay that long if they don't get along with the parents. And you can't fire your parent, right? So that's something you see all over. What has been your experience there, working with players and their parents in some form?
Yeah, I mean, I've had, obviously with Maria, her father was really, really involved from a young age. And, the first couple of years I was with her, he was traveling everywhere. I mean, I got along with him really well because, I think the worst thing you can do as a coach is to sit there. A lot of coaches do this and get rid of your parents, don't listen to your parents. I think that's the dumbest thing you can do. I mean, first of all, that, like I said, there'd be no Maria Sharapova if it wasn't for her father. Okay. He sacrificed from a young age, and she was smart enough to know that. Right. So, but then you also have to I feel like you, in a little ways, you have to kind of educate both of them, in a way. I know with Maria, I helped her, I think, a lot dealing with him, partly because he was very similar to my father. So I felt how you kind of deal with with him, we can use them as a benefit to you, which we did, right? And then the same with him. Like, I tried to help him a little bit of like thinking more of like what she's thinking, kind of like I'm a player, and he respected me as a player. And, when I first met her, I was still playing, right? So, he respected me. And so I think it was a good relationship because it was kind of an open communication where we kind of all helped each other. And I think that's why we were able to have good success those years, especially while he was traveling. And Jessie was totally different. Like Jessie's parents, were like, they were kind of more hands off, but at the same time, like her dad, he loves sports. I mean, he owns the Buffalo Bills and hockey, and, he's, tons of money. He's very like, he wanted success, right? And he wanted, he wasn't just like doing this, and he wanted the best for Jessie, but he also, like a successful person, he wanted like her to do well and everything. And so it was a similar thing. Like, I think I probably helped her kind of realize some of the things he said or did were, like, because that's another thing too, like as a kid, or the player always, the parent, like some of the things Jessie's dad would do, I would think was funny. Like I'd be like, this is funny, but because it's her dad, it was like a huge deal, right? And I'm like, I mean, I used to do with my dad, like he'd say something that like probably anybody else would think is funny or not a big deal, but to me it was a big deal. So I think I helped her a lot to, same, like to kind of deal with that. And, and then, I think every player kind of has that. Like I said, you're not going to see one good player. I don't think there's ever been one really good player champion that didn't have like a parent or an uncle who isn't heavily involved, and then also pushes the kids because, at 7, 8, 9 years old, who's going to like drive their kid to practice every day or feed them balls or take them? Like, it's a rare to even be a kid that's good, right? Like all those years of when you're 9, 10, 11, all those years that you need to be playing, for a parent to drive you and take you and hit the balls with you, you're not going to see one good player that doesn't have a parent that's heavily involved. And so it's a really tricky when then all of a sudden the player is kind of like, now they're an adult, it's their life, it's their job. Hopefully the parent like realizes they have raised the kid correctly to want to keep pushing and going, but it's also, you still obviously have that support. So it's a tricky situation, obviously. And I think the men probably transition a little bit easier, partly because maybe when they start to do well, they're sometimes a little bit older. I mean, you see some of these men, I mean, very seldom, 17, 18-year-old, Alcaraz or, whatever. But like most of the men start to break through like 23, 24. They're a man. It's easier for them to travel. And they're, a lot of the women, if they're really good, they start to do good in their teens or, and then it's hard for a lot of times the parents to, I don't even want to say let go because they don't let go, but give the kid the freedom and the trust, which I also think makes the kid better. If the parent's good at, feels that they can do that, I think ultimately makes the kid stronger. Because, what's the biggest confidence we have as humans? We're like, once we can support ourselves, once we can, do that in life, I think it's going to transfer over to the court. I've seen players who have done pretty well, but their parents are right there. And then all of a sudden, maybe 23, 24, they don't want their parents there all the time. And then their whole tennis goes down the drain because they've never done anything on their own, right? So now all of a sudden it's 5-0 on the third and they got to figure out how to win on their own. Doesn't always work, right? So, I think you see a lot of the top players and the really good ones, that's a huge part of their development. I think it's a huge part of ultimately them becoming champions, really.
When you stop working with a player, and that happens at some point usually, right? It's kind of like a breakup in a relationship in a way. You've been traveling together, you've been doing all these things together for such a long time. Sometimes it's amicable, sometimes there's some tension there. How do you deal with that? Do you have any learnings from the process? And is quite difficult then to start anew with a new player? It must be as a coach as well, because you have to reboot, your whole head.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. I mean, one thing for me that I always feel like has probably helped me, in coaching in general is I get just as excited, honestly, about like if I work with somebody who's maybe not, playing on the tour, but they're playing junior tournament, or they're playing, to see them improve and see them, win something or feel good about, like, I get just as much excitement with that as I do, like, even if you're winning like a big pro tournament, like I'm excited also. But it's like, I mean, I remember even with Maria, like, after I was with Maria for the 7 years or whatever, I started coaching Jessie, and like Jessie was 16 when we started, or just about 17. And, we went to a bunch of smaller tournaments and everything. And then she got a wild card in the U.S. Open qualifying because she was starting to do pretty good. We've been together for maybe like 5 months or something. And she got a wild card qualifying. I remember she won her first round of qualifying. She actually beat this girl, Kiki Burdens, who went on to be a really good player also. And Jessie won the match, and I was so pumped. And she was on like a backcourt in qualifying U.S. Open. The year before I was with Maria when she won the U.S. Open. And so I'm on this backcourt, nobody's watching. I remember like so pumped after. I'm walking back to the lounge, and some guy comes up to me and like, he's like, hey, he's like, don't, like, doesn't it feel weird? You're like coaching a qualifying player when you used to coach Maria. And I was like, what an asshole, like, but I was thinking like, yeah, it's not weird. Like, we worked hard and she's won a match. Like, it was just as big for her as like Maria winning, semifinals U.S. Open. So, I've always been like that. And even with Ashlyn, like, she won a pro tournament last year. Obviously, I was super excited. But I was with her when she won nationals. Like, when she was 18, I was super excited. And so for me, it's like, where somebody is in their level, especially if you spend the time and you spend the time working with them, and you're part of their development at whatever stage. It to me, it's exciting. So, when I'm done with somebody, regardless of why or how, I'm always looking for my next challenge, and I'm always like, jump in pretty quick because, especially if I feel like I can help them, and then I kind of just, I obviously have to take in, their level, how they play, their personality, all of that. But, when it comes to like motivation, for me, I feel like I'm just as motivated to even work with like a 40-year-old woman that, wants to like serve better. I mean, even last couple of years, I spent more time at home and stuff. And I remember giving a lesson to a guy who was like, picked up tennis at like 45, and we were working on his forehand, a couple lessons. And I saw him at lunch, and he came up, he's like, man, you helped me so much. Like, I'm doing this, made me feel really good. So I think that's, as a player and everything, I as a coach, I just love the game of tennis. And, if I can help somebody, get better, it's going to fire me up just as much. So I'm a tennis nerd like you are, right? I think that's the ultimate, like, to help somebody with my experience and pass it on, I think is great.
When you are looking for a player, or you're seeing a player like Ashlyn, for example, is there anything you look for, especially that you're like, this I like, this needs work, or when you make the analysis and you start being interested in maybe working with this player?
Yeah, I mean, I think myself as a player, I think I did pretty well. I mean, I probably could have done better, but I always, probably if I look at like what probably made me even as good as I was like my toughness. Like, ultimately we're playing a game, right? So, I think, you can talk about strokes and technique and all of these things, but, if you're going to be good, you have to be tough, and the competitiveness and wanting to win and pretty much, fighting hard and not giving up. And, to me, that's the biggest quality. And then obviously I started working with Maria, who's probably like one of the best at that, a female of all time, right? Like, she's right up there from a woman's standpoint, like Nadal or whatever. So, that was kind of like just getting off the tour and knowing her and starting to work with her and seeing how many matches she won. Everybody always like looks at their games. I mean, same like Serena. I mean, yeah, Serena, unbelievable player, but what also made her the greatest of all time is her competitiveness and how many matches she won when her back's against the wall. And, so that became probably even more important, after being with Maria. And then even with Jessie, like, I could see early on what a fighter she was. I mean, she wasn't like with Maria, everybody kind of felt like she was going to be great, right? Like she was like a phenom at, 12 years old, 13. So, obviously I know I helped her and, I was a part of her career, whatever, but like she could have maybe been great. It probably would have been great even if I worked with her or not. But with Jessie, she kind of came a little bit out of nowhere. Like she didn't have an unbelievable junior career. She played up a lot. So she was used to like losing. I mean, she was playing 13 years old, playing like girls 18s. And she had not the traditional, didn't play a lot of ITF juniors. She didn't really have a traditional upbringing, you would say, compared to like 99% of the players. Her family was really wealthy. So a lot of people kind of wrote her off. Like a lot of people even thought I was coaching her just because her dad's a billionaire, So I had a lot of that early on, but I knew how tough she was. She's a tough cookie. Like, I saw her win lots of matches, 25Ks, 50Ks when, nobody even knew that she even played tennis, right? And I saw her fighting and, she always worked really hard. My standards for her were probably higher than any other coach would have had because I had just come from Maria, right? So it wasn't easy for her either. Like I'm coming from Maria and I'm expecting her to fight and compete and this and that, and to her credit, she did it, did most of it. We even had some talks sometimes. She'd be like, how come you weren't better? If I have to be so tough, how come you weren't? And I'm like, well, listen, I could have been tougher, but like, but anyway, the point is that like, I think that's ultimately why she became such a great player, and she's top 5 in the world and she's done so well because she has that fight. And with Ashlyn, I feel like she has that, like, from, I met her when she was maybe, I think 15 or 16. I saw her win Orange Bowl, not just win tournaments, but you can see it in practice. You can see, she's stubborn and, she's young and, sometimes, it's not always like perfect rosy and stuff, but like, she's a tough cookie. Like, she's going to fight back. She's going to bounce back. And to me, that's the best quality she has. Now, she has to keep that and she needs to keep, nurturing it and keep, getting it stronger. I mean, Sabalenka, a good example. I saw Sabalenka when she was 17, 18, 19. I saw her lose some terrible matches and do some crazy things, but you could tell she was a fighter. She wanted it. She kept bouncing back. And ultimately, I think that's what's made her a champion as well, right? So I think the game is going to follow, right? If you have the tools and you good at, the athletic ability, I think that will come little by little, but you can't really always teach that toughness and that fight and that competitiveness. And tennis, like you have to bounce back, you're going to have a lot of losses. You're going to have a lot of, tough situations, matches, and bouncing back, I think is probably the most important thing. And, a lot of players, I mean, most of probably the top players have that because I don't think they'd make it there if they did. But I've run across a lot of players who are mediocre players, who are players that have good talent, but you just don't feel like they're going to really make it because how bad do they want it? That's such a big thing. So that was a long answer, but nothing's more important than that, from my eyes.
No, the mental part of tennis is like everybody knows on every level. It's so important that you fight and you get the ball back and you see what happens.
Exactly.
You've been successful both as a player and as a coach. Not everyone does that kind of journey like you have. What are the things that helped you become a coach? Like, I mean, obviously seeing your father do it as well might have helped, of course. But do you know after your career, like, I have to do this? This is what I want to do. This is natural to me, or was it a process for you?
Yeah, it was pretty natural for me. It's actually a funny story how I got into it because, nowadays players play until their late 30s, right? But like I'm 51 now. I pretty much stopped playing in 28, 29 years old. I had some injuries and then my mom got really sick when I was like 27. And so I kind of was playing, but I was kind of like half playing. I was home a lot. She was going through chemo and different stuff. And so I was ranked like 120 or 130, and I was playing a lot of open tournaments. So I was still in good shape. I was still playing, but I was spending a lot of time at home. And so I needed to make some money, some extra money and stuff. And it was funny. There was this one boy and his name was Robert Yim. He ended up winning the nationals, the boys 18 nationals. But it was kind of funny because that's kind of what made me start thinking like I could be a good coach, because I played him in a tournament in Calabasas. It was a qualifying of like a 50K. I was like 28 years old, and I beat him like 1-1. And he was this little guy, lefty, really talented player. And I played Rios a bunch of times, Marcelo Rios, when he was, top or whatever. And the kid reminded me a lot of Rios, but like he missed every ball. He was trying to serve bomb. Like I beat him like 1-1. And the head of the USTA at the time, I don't want to say his name, but he came up to me and he's like, "Oh, this is one of our top juniors. Like, what do you think of his talent?" And he's like, and I said, "Guy's terrible. Like he's like plays like an idiot, And he's like, oh, and he didn't want to hear my opinion, right? But for some reason, I don't know if the kid heard it or what, but then he like, somehow I can't remember, but like a couple days later, I practiced with him, and I told him, I'm like, "Robert, man, you got all this talent. You got, you're a little guy. You got to change some things in your game, So we started like practicing a couple times a week. I gave him some advice, just, I didn't even charge him, whatever. I was just trying to help the kid out. And then he like started to play much better. He like right away, he like qualified for the LA Open. He went to Kalamazoo. He won the nationals at Kalamazoo. He went to US Open. He played Todd Martin like 4 sets. He was like my first kind of person I like helped. And there was another guy named Kevin Kim, who was a good player. He got the top 100 briefly. And I played him like 6 or 7 times my final year. And he was always really tough. And he was doing some things like not technically, he was doing some things like strategically when I played him that I felt like he wasn't smart, like how he was using his game. And then I kind of helped him out with a few things, saying like as a player myself playing against him. And, I was like, "I think on big points, you should be doing this, blah, blah, blah." And then right away, he won like 3 challengers. So I was like, I was like, "Hey, I think I could be pretty good at this." Plus, and so I actually, I tried to get a job with the USTA, and then they told me I didn't have any coaching experience at the time and I needed some more coaching experience. And then I kind of backed into the job with Maria. And then, from there it was like, with Maria, it was same, like, right off the bat, she's playing like these top players. She was 17. Like I knew her game well. I hit with her a ton and stuff, but I helped her a lot with strategy, and how she was playing against these girls, Kuznetsova and Serena, all these players. Like the strategy for me, especially with her game, was really simple because it was kind of like boys 18s, like when I was, a top 18. And so, seeing the game, from that was really simple for me. I felt like, and plus being a player and the fact that I could still play pretty good, I think they really listened to me because I could kind of do a lot of the stuff that I wanted them to do, or I could play them. In Maria's case, I was still like beating her like, 6-1, 6-1, right when I was like traveling with her. So she was kind of listening to me. I'm like, "Listen, you should be doing this, whatever." So I think that kind of, and then obviously, I'm always learning. I mean, even now you see the game changes. I'm kind of a student of the game. I see what people are doing. I love watching tennis. I love seeing like, the men, the women, how the game changes, what works for certain players. And so to me, that's what I really like. So the transition to coaching was pretty easy for me. I think the last thing was obviously getting to know the players. I think after spending so much time with Maria, when I started working with Jesse, I had to kind of change a few like approaches. Maria, they had the on-court coaching in those days. So like, with Maria, if I went on the court, I needed to sometimes maybe fire her up or piss her off, or, usually I didn't go on the court unless she really needed like kind of like a shot, right? But then with Jesse, that didn't really work that good. I'd go on the court and like try to piss her off, and then she didn't perform well like that. So I had to like do other things, and and I think it's just a trial and error and just like experience, But again, like being able to have that experience with different players, I think, and then also when I have off weeks, or even, I like coaching juniors, or, I've coached all different levels, because I think it also keeps you sharp, and it keeps you kind of, because like you said, I mean, the mental side of the game, no matter what level you are, is probably the most important. And, and then if you're going to improve, you need to be mentally in the right frame of mind to be willing to make those improvements. So I think bringing a lot of the experience of working with different levels and different players to whoever I'm working with, I think usually they like that. And I think it's ultimately why, they enjoy my time with them. I think it's important.
You mentioned that the game has evolved quite a lot. I mean, you quit some time ago, but you've been coaching players all along. But what have you seen as the big changes, like in tennis, how they play, equipment, data analytics, all this stuff?
Yeah, I think, it's crazy, but I mean, I think you'll see it, like the men are a perfect example. I don't think the top level of the game has changed that much. I think actually a lot of the players, that's why you see like Djokovic or Nadal, if Federer was healthy and playing, he'd still probably be doing pretty well, right? So, and the women, same thing. Like, I mean, Henin in her prime, I think could win the French, right now. So I don't think the top like 10 or the top level, once you went to graphite rackets, once you went to the Luxilon string, all the strings and the rackets are pretty similar the last like 20 years. So I don't think there's a huge difference in the skill level. I think you see a lot more depth. I think what's changed is obviously you see people playing a lot longer because I think the physical side, nutrition, obviously the players make a lot more money now than they did. A player ranked 50 in the world makes a lot more money now than they did even 10 years ago. So they're able to hire a physio or a trainer, or even if they can't travel full time, they probably have bigger teams around them who can, keep them healthier, nutrition, so you see a lot more depth. I mean, even when I was with Maria, I think, like I said, I think the top 10 probably, 20 years ago was maybe better than the top 10 now. I mean, when you had like Serena and Venus and Henin and Clijsters and Davenport, I mean, I would put probably Clijsters up against Sakari right now. I mean, I hate to say, I think she would beat her for sure. Or, a lot of Kuznetsova, so I don't really think the top of the game has changed much, but I do think girls rank like 80, 70, 60 are a lot better. I think there's maybe 200-300 girls are good, where back then maybe there was like 40 or 50, so, on the men, it's probably even more, right? So you had got, the depth could be up to 500, 600, even higher. So, I think the biggest thing, and that's why I think the consistency is so important. I don't think you're going to see as many like dominant, I mean, I remember first 2 years of Maria, she never lost before I think she lost in the quarters of French Open a few times, but she was always getting to the semifinals or finals. You never didn't see upsets as much. You see a lot more of that now because the level has gotten much closer. But that's really the only difference. I wouldn't say, even like physical, like I think physical is helping the players. Well, I mean, that's hard to say too, because a lot more players are injured now too. But I think taking care of your body, the nutrition and the physical is helping the longevity of the careers. But I wouldn't say like, the athletes are so much better than they were 20 years ago. I don't see it. That's why I think you see like Djokovic can still like dominate. He's going down a little bit now, but up 38 years old, 37 years old. So, but I do think the level's much deeper, if that makes sense. You see, girls, you play girl ranked 80 on a given day, she can, beat a top player. For, that didn't happen as much maybe 10, 12 years ago. But I think that's ultimately shows just because there's more players, there's more money, because they have more money, they could probably hire, better. I mean, when I was younger, we got $5,000 for losing first round of a Grand Slam, $8,000 at the end. So, I mean, I was lucky to travel with a coach. I couldn't travel with a trainer and a nutritionalist and a psychologist and a coach. And, and I think sometimes that's too much too. So it's got to be like a fine balance. But I do think makes it easier for players. That's another thing too. Like even if you're like 80 in the world and you play for a year, maybe you get injured or you get hurt, you don't play for 6-8 months. Maybe you've made enough money to keep you going so you can play again in 8 months, right? Where with us, if you weren't playing week in and week out to pay the bills, if you had 6 months off, you better go teach tennis or something. You can't just rely on jumping in a slam and making 80,000 for losing first round, right? So I think it gives the players longer, and even the challengers, a lot of these men's challengers now, you see I think there was a challenger in Little Rock, Arkansas last week. The winner still got 15, 16,000. When the top player was ranked 300, 200, when you didn't have as many opportunities. So there's more tournaments, which is great for tennis. It makes the sport bigger and improve. But I think the players have a lot more opportunities now than they had before. Players now probably don't want to admit, they don't want to think back, but it was tough like 10, 15 years ago. You had to be top 100, top 80 to even have a chance to play. You couldn't play that long if you were 200 in the world. But I think I see men now that are like 200, who are between 100 and 200. They're playing, for 8 years. I don't know how they can do that, but they can. So, and then imagine you're playing those 8 years. You're gonna maybe in 6 years improve. Like, people don't realize too, you can improve in your mid-20s, late 20s. A lot when we were playing back then, by mid-20s, late 20s, if you hadn't made it, you're probably done playing. You go into another business. So I think that's also why you see the depth, basically. So I think it's great for tennis.
Do you follow up like on nutrition and the kind of physical aspect of tennis for you as a coach? Like, do you stay up to date with this stuff, and how important is that to the players you work with as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing about being a coach too, it's like you're constantly, you can see a lot what other players are doing. A lot of the trainers and nutritionists, like, they're obviously, I have good relationships with a lot of them because either I've worked with them before, like Swiatek's trainer, this guy Maciek, Polish guy. I traveled with him for like a year when I was coaching Tomea Babos, and he was working, and he was just getting his foot into tennis, and he's such a smart guy, and he's amazing at what he does. He's both like a trainer and a physio, and like he's given me some stuff to help with Ashlyn, because obviously she's just starting out, so she doesn't have the money yet to have a huge team around her, so it's pretty much just her and I, especially on the road, and so I try to help her as much as I can, or little things, and he gives me some advice, and I feel like over the years I've been around some really good people. And so I try to do what I can. It's hard for me to be like full on trainer, push, nutritionist, that's where I think sometimes I try to do what I can, but at the same time, I think that's probably the biggest thing of when you're a player and let's say you have like 2 or 3 people, that's probably the benefit of it is it's easier for like another person to like push the player into going into the gym, or like with Maciek, if he, like he can do stuff with Iga that the coach doesn't have to like necessarily push her to do. And then it's easier for then the coach to kind of push her on the court. And, they probably all have a role. I know with Maria, we traveled with a physio who could also do some fitness with her and stuff. And it was kind of nice. Sometimes I could take a step back and he can push her in those areas. And, I think that's probably the best thing when you do have the money, that you can have a couple people. I think that's probably really good. Obviously, I don't give Ashlyn massages, and I don't, if she wants a little stretch, I can do that, whatever. But they have that at the tournaments for now, and so we do the best we can. And I think also with my experience, I do have people I can go to if I have questions. And then when she has off weeks, that's when she works hard physically. And like last year off season, she spent a month in Boca, and we focus a lot on her physical, and and also she's a tall girl, and she's just turned 20, and she's going to get stronger. I think it's a marathon, it's not a sprint, because that's another thing too. If like you can all sit and like focus huge on that, and then could create an injury or could change something, right? So again, it's like little by little, I think is kind of the way to go. But it's pretty easy to get information these days. It's how you use it and how the player responds to it, I think, is the most important.
Talking about information, there's like a rise in data analytics and getting like the keys to the match from some data team. Now you can purchase this stuff like this service before matches, and is it something you believe in, or you think there's overhype, or what's your take on the kind of advanced data?
It's a great question. I think it's like 50-50. I mean, again, you can get so much information now. We were getting good information years ago. I mean, it was harder to get, but I remember even when I was playing, my dad could watch tons of videos and he would chart matches, and it was done a little bit, take a little more time to do, or but nowadays you can get like a printout of pretty much anything, right? And I think all of the companies are going to say that they do it better than somebody else. And it's always changing, getting better. But again, it comes down to like, how much can the player take into the match? I mean, how much, at the end of the day, every player has tendencies, every player has, but you have to play your game. You have to play, if somebody like Pegula, Jessie, has a great backhand and her forehand, let's say Coco Gauff. Okay. We all know her forehand's weaker. She doesn't create everything, right? Now, if you tell Coco, okay, you got to play this girl's forehand like crazy, right? Now, if you play that girl's forehand, that girl's going to start playing more balls into your forehand, right? So maybe that isn't great always, right? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. So again, like you have to know how your player takes the information, what's more important for your player compared to somebody else. A lot of these analytic companies will have a player, they have all their tendencies, they'll have what they like and what they don't like, but how does that match up to your player? That's crucial. And then on top of it, how much information can you give the player? I mean, it's tough. I mean, it's not going to be as straightforward as like baseball, Moneyball and stuff. A lot of these analytic companies will try to tell you it is, but I always say like John Isner, I mean, I made my living. I had a great returner serve, probably the best part of my game. And, I was really good at like beating a lot of the big servers, and I had a kind of pretty good idea, on big points where they like to go, or I could read, where they like to serve. That was probably like the best thing I could do. And a lot of that I learned during the match, right? And it's like, and, I used to tell these guys, I'm like, John Isner had an unbelievable career, and his whole career, he served, over 90%, holding serve, 91%. From the first, his beginning of his career till the end, I mean, that's proof. He was holding between 90 and 92% of the time. And then all these analytic companies came in, and one of the biggest things they'll say is like, where does a person like to serve on a big point? Or, right. That's proof right there. Like, I mean, how important, if it was so like, I'm sure John Isner, I think where they help the most is maybe looking at stuff from your own player. Does your own player have tendencies on big points that they constantly do the same thing, or, little things like that? I think you could maybe help your player become a little better by seeing stuff. So of course it's nice to know if you're playing somebody you don't know, or you haven't really seen, you have an idea of what they're going to do. But it's always, I think all the best coaches are going to tell you, you can use it. It's a tool, but it's not going to really make the difference always in the match. I mean, I'm yet to like see something that I'd be like, oh, like, thank God the guy told me this, or you went to one kind of thing. Right. So it's like, it's definitely a tool, but I do think it's a really good tool to help your players. Nowadays, the players, I mean, I think it probably was before, but we have more access to it. It's good for the players to see things, visually. I think most of the players can learn visually, so a lot of times you can get some clips on videos and some stuff, or show your player like, listen, next time you're in a situation, you see, maybe you should do this or this. And if they can see it like video wise, I think it helps a lot, so I use it some for that and everything, but it's give and take for sure.
When it comes to equipment, is that something you discuss, or is it like most players are quite set on what they use, like in terms of string tension and racket, of course, but
yeah,
is it something that people discuss, generally?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the better players, you're not going to see them making a ton of changes. I think, I even remember with Ashlyn, she used to use Bob a lot in the juniors. And then when she turned pro, she was going to switch to another company, and we tried a bunch of rackets and different string, and she ended up using Wilson. And, I think, everybody's a little bit different. I think, like I said, majority of really good players don't change that often. You might, do a little bit with the swing weight, a little bit here and there, or, maybe they change a little bit. The tensions change quite a bit based on like the surfaces and the, cool, because that makes a difference like right away, so if you could change on the surface but like changing the rackets, there's probably a few that do it probably a lot just because they're used to doing that or whatever. But most of the players I've worked with, sometimes you have to look at it if you start to have an injury. I dealt with it a lot with Maria, like when she hurt her shoulder or when she was dealing with shoulder problems, because if you have an arm problems, usually that you got to look at the equipment, you look at your technique, but it's not always easy to change technique. And then the next thing you'd look at would be like actually, you'd probably look at your string and racket first and then technique. But, but if somebody's number one in the world or, they're a great player, you're not going to mess that much with technique, right? So then you got to look at the equipment and string and stuff. But usually if you're healthy, you're playing a good level, I don't think a racket's going to make that much of a difference, or string especially. I think a lot of like maybe average players, it can make a big difference. I think sometimes players are stuck in a rut of maybe using a certain racket that they feel comfortable with, but then all of a sudden, like maybe they change. That happened with me, actually. I was a Yonex player from when I was 18, and Babolat had just, and I love Yonex. I still use Yonex, whatever, but when I was like 26, 27, they came out with the Babolats. You being a tennis nerd will love this story. So remember the blue Babolat and the Pro Drive and the red Babolat, right? So like Roddick used and Ginepri and stuff. And so there was this one guy, his name was Ivan Miranda. I'll never forget this. And I used Yonex, and I had the same RD7 or something for like 4 or 5 years, and I could put the ball on a dime, and I was really consistent. And I played this guy, beat him pretty bad somewhere, this Ivan Miranda. And like about a year later, I played him in Memphis. He was like a clay courter too. I played him in Memphis indoors, and the guy was using the blue Babolat. He had a one-hand backhand, and he was serving like 130, and he's ripping balls that are like, jumping off the court. And I'm like, what the heck is going on? And then Roddick was just coming up, and I played him a couple times, and he's serving like 140. And I'm sitting here going like, what the hell? And I remember I finally went home and I told my dad, I said, I think I have to change rackets. Like I had tried a couple times, and back then they were using sometimes a longer racket, an inch or two. Like I had tried everything, but I always went back to my trusty racket that I liked. And I remember I went to the store, I bought 3 of the Babolats, the red ones especially. The blue one I couldn't control at all. And then I went to the red one, and I felt like I was playing terrible. Like I was missing balls, whatever. My serve, I felt pretty good. Like I had more pop on it, whenever. And I decided to go to the Open like a week later and play with the Babolat. And I went there and I won like 2 rounds, and I felt like I wasn't playing good. But like it changed the game. Like all of a sudden my ball had more on it. So I wasn't like, the points weren't as long. I was serving much bigger. I was for sure serving 10 miles an hour. But I think sometimes every, 10 years, maybe something comes out that's like a lot different, right? Or a string or something. But I think for the most part, the improvements the racket companies make, or sometimes they say it improves and maybe it really doesn't, So I think you'll see most of the time, you'll see a player probably for most of the career use the same racket, maybe a tad different here or there, but I don't think you see huge changes that often. Maybe in a 20-year career, you might see a few, but not that often,
No.
So that was a funny story, because I think if you look back at the history of tennis, there was probably 3 or 4 rackets that like really like kind of changed rackets. I think the Babolats were one. I think before that was probably the Wilson Pro Staff, right? And then you had the head, there's certain rackets where you look, and there was a period where maybe 15 years ago where probably 40 or 50 guys in the top 100 were using Babolat, so more, so obviously those rackets were probably a lot better than the rackets before that. But I think it's hard to make that much of a change overnight.
Yeah, it's all ingrained in the muscle memory, so it's a tricky for sure. It takes a lot of time, So
exactly.
Final question I have for you is: you're also part of Coach Life, a platform I've tried and I really enjoyed, and Happy to be ambassador for them because I think it's a great product that Peter has created there. And
Yes.
and I see your lessons are excellent. I can really recommend them. So when you worked on that, like you worked with pros of the highest caliber, but you also work with amateurs. And is there something you see when you pick the topics, like how can I help players on a more wider scale that you do in coaching?
Sure.
How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that was really exciting for me because also, like, when I shot those were like a little over a year ago. And at the time, I actually had a bad injury. I broke my leg, like right a little bit before that. Yeah, I had been with USTA for a couple years. That's when I was coaching Ashton a lot. And then I left USTA. Went back down to Delray Beach where I lived, and I was given a lesson, and I actually broke my leg really bad, and I needed surgery and stuff. And it was a really bad injury. So I pretty much was on the couch for like 3 months. I obviously wasn't working, I felt kind of, I couldn't really, and I started to get a little bit into like the online stuff, right? And, and then I saw how many coaches were actually like coaching players, and especially, I mean, I think, we've been talking about professionals and the highest level of tennis, and, that's 1% of tennis, right? Or even less. And you got so many amateur players, you have juniors, you have, so many levels of tennis and people that love tennis, and there's so much, and you have the whole world, right? So I live in Florida, and Boca, it's like a mecca of tennis. You could go down the street and get a lesson, right? But if you think about how big the world is and how many people love the sport, and how many like kids, their parents or their coaches, or they can't afford to have a full-time coach, and there's just endless possibilities. And I think when Peter came to me, I had started my own website just to help a few people who I was actually at USTA. I was working with a few other juniors and players that went to college or did different things, and then it's hard when you're used to a coach, or you're used to a training environment, and then you go to a college, let's say, or you go, you all of a sudden, it usually happens when you go to college or something, where now all of a sudden you have different coaches, you're playing for a team, and then a lot of this stuff that maybe you had been working on for 2-3 years is kind of like not forgotten, but it's like all of a sudden you're not seeing the same people. So I was helping out a few players who went to college and different stuff, and I was able to do some stuff online. I could see their matches, and I could, and there's so much you can do online now. So I was kind of getting into it a little bit right when Peter called me. So it was kind of cool. And my leg I just got off of crutches when I would shot all that stuff. I actually watching it, I'm like, oh, I was actually doing okay. But I had a couple weeks off of crutches, and, it's fun for me to, you have so much experience. That's why I also like coaching some of the juniors and stuff, or helping them, because a lot of their journey has to do with how much should they play, what tournament should they play? Am I playing ITF? Am I playing USTA? There's UTR. There's all these things that, take away sometimes with just getting better as a player, or improving skills, or, different things. And so, I think that's what the idea of Coach Life was great, because you're getting a lot of the coaches who worked with these top players, or players who, before anybody knew they were going to be great. So, and I think all of us coaches, a lot of the information we give is because, it's worked before, or, or this works for somebody, but this worked for somebody else. There's a million ways to get to the top, or to get, but every player has a different way of doing it, a different, but I think there's a lot of things that are the same, you could see like certain, languages, certain things you preach, certain things you work on. And I think that's, again, with all the information there is out there, it's easy to kind of sometimes lose kind of like the basic things, which I think a lot of the basic things are super important, especially for kids that are developing. And so for me, I felt like all the years of experience as a player, as a coach, I could really benefit a lot of, even if I think I'm just giving them 5-10%, it could be huge for them, right? Some kid in Africa that like all he has is dad, and, he loves tennis, and he's going out there 2-3 hours a day, and after a few days, they don't really know what to do, or different drills, or different, and it could help that kid maybe get a scholarship to college one day or something, So for me, that to be part of that platform is exciting. And then obviously anything I can do from my own side, you know, and helping, like I said earlier, helping those kids and the parents, and, you know, even club players who, you know, retire, and tennis is everything to them, right? So I think we can reach a much bigger, wide range of people without, you know, you can do it from your hotel room, 10, 15 minutes and different stuff. So I think that's exciting that we didn't have 20 years ago, you know, so it's I think people will really like it for sure.
I'm sure they will. You're a great coach. You're a great guy to talk to. Really enjoyed this conversation. I could keep going for hours, but we don't have an infinite time. But I want to wish you all the best with Ashlyn.
Thank you.
Your success now in Nottingham and on the grass. And I hope to see you somewhere around on the tour. That would be
Yes. Yeah, for sure. I'll see you in person one of these days.
I hope so.
Absolutely.
I hope so.
Thanks for having me.
Really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed it, man. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.